When I first arrived at Kappa Sigma Theta, I was ecstatic. The beautiful Victorian mansion stood proudly on Sorority Row, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. As a freshman, I couldn't believe my luck in being accepted into such a prestigious house. The other girls seemed nice enough, all smiles and giggles as we moved our belongings in. That first night, exhausted from unpacking, I fell into a deep sleep. But around 3 a.m., I jolted awake. The floorboards outside my room creaked, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. My heart raced as I watched the doorknob slowly turn. But when the door swung open, there was no one there. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a product of new surroundings and first-day jitters. But as the weeks passed, strange occurrences became the norm. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without warning, and the eerie sound of a girl weeping would echo through the halls at night. My roommate, Michelle, seemed oblivious to it all. When I'd wake her up, panicked about the noises, she'd just roll over and go back to sleep. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. That is, until the night I saw her. It was a stormy Friday evening, and most of the girls had gone out to party. I stayed behind, using the quiet time to catch up on studying. As lightning flashed outside my window, I caught a glimpse of something in the hallway mirror. A girl with long, dark hair and a white nightgown stood at the end of the corridor. When I turned to look, she was gone. My curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate, armed with only my phone's flashlight. As I crept down the hallway, the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite it being early autumn. I reached the spot where I'd seen the girl, finding nothing but an old painting of the sorority's founding members. One face stood out, a girl with familiar long, dark hair. The plaque beneath read, Elizabeth Richardson, 1962. Something about her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. Suddenly my phone died, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled my way back to my room. The next morning, I cornered our house mother, Mrs. Daniels. "Who was Elizabeth Richardson?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Daniels' face paled. "Where did you hear that name?" she whispered. I told her about the painting, omitting the part about seeing Elizabeth's ghost. Mrs. Daniels sighed heavily. "I suppose it's time you knew. Back in '62, Elizabeth was a student here. She was found dead in her room under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was suicide, others whisper about foul play. Ever since then, strange things have happened in this house." Armed with this new information, I dove into research. I spent hours in the university library, poring over old newspapers and yearbooks. The more I uncovered about Elizabeth, the more unsettled I became. She had been a bright, popular student, involved in various clubs and activities. There was no apparent reason for her to take her own life. One article caught my eye. It mentioned Elizabeth's boyfriend, a young man named James, who had been the last person to see her alive. He claimed they'd had an argument that night, but he'd left her alive and well. The police had questioned him but found no evidence of foul play. As I walked back to the sorority house that evening, lost in thought, I felt a chill run down my spine. Looking up, I saw a figure in one of the upper windows, Elizabeth. Our eyes met, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and urgency. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was Elizabeth, arguing with James in my room. He was angry, accusing me of cheating. Things escalated quickly. Before I knew it, his hands were around my throat. I woke up gasping for air, my own hands clutching my neck. I knew then that Elizabeth wasn't trying to scare us. She was trying to tell us something. Her death wasn't suicide, it was murder. And her killer had never been brought to justice. But how could I prove something that happened over 50 years ago? Little did I know, Elizabeth had more to show me. The next few nights were a blur of paranormal activity. Objects flew across rooms, lights flickered on and off, and the sound of Elizabeth's weeping grew louder and more frequent. It was as if she knew I was trying to help and was becoming more insistent. One particularly active night, I followed the sounds of sobbing to the attic. As I pushed open the creaky door, the temperature plummeted. In the far corner, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, sat an old trunk. With trembling hands, I approached it. The lock was rusted, but it gave way with a firm tug. Inside, I found a treasure trove of Elizabeth's belongings. Diaries, photos, and letters filled the trunk. But one item stood out, a small leather-bound journal hidden at the bottom. As I opened it, a newspaper clipping fell out. It was an obituary for James, Elizabeth's boyfriend. He had died just last month. Flipping through the journal, my blood ran cold. Elizabeth had documented James's possessive behavior, his jealous rages, and her growing fear of him. The last entry, dated the night of her death, read, "If anything happens to me, Jay is responsible. The necklace is proof." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. In the mirror across the room, I saw Elizabeth's reflection. She wasn't looking at me, though. Her gaze was fixed on something behind me. Slowly, I turned around. There, materializing before my eyes, was the ghostly figure of a young man, James. His face was contorted with rage as he lunged towards me. I screamed, dropping the journal and scrambling backwards. Just as his icy fingers were about to close around my throat, Elizabeth appeared between us. She stood her ground, her ethereal form glowing with a fierce light. The two spirits faced off in a silent, intense confrontation. The attic shook, and objects swirled around us in a supernatural whirlwind. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Both ghosts vanished, leaving me alone in the now silent attic. Shaken but determined, I gathered Elizabeth's journal and the newspaper clipping. The next day, I took everything to the police. They were skeptical at first, but the journal provided enough reasonable doubt to reopen the case. Modern forensic techniques applied to Elizabeth's exhumed remains confirmed that she had been strangled. Though James was beyond earthly justice, the truth had finally come to light. Elizabeth's family found peace, and a memorial was erected on campus in her honor. As for the sorority house, the paranormal activity ceased. Elizabeth, her story finally told, was able to rest. I stayed in the house for the rest of my college years. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd feel a gentle, comforting presence. And in the mirror, just for a moment, I'd catch a glimpse of Elizabeth, smiling. She had found justice, and I had found a friend in the most unexpected place. It was just another boring Friday night on campus when my friends and I decided to spice things up. We'd always been curious about that old, dilapidated building at the edge of the university grounds. You know the one. Every campus has it. The place that's been abandoned for years, with rumors swirling about its dark history. "Let's check it out," Jake suggested, his eyes glinting with mischief. April and Mike nodded eagerly, but I hesitated. Something about that place had always given me the creeps. Still, I didn't want to be the party pooper, so I reluctantly agreed. As we approached the building, the air seemed to grow colder. The windows were like dead eyes staring down at us, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. Jake found a broken window, and we climbed inside, the glass crunching beneath our feet. The interior was a maze of dusty corridors and empty rooms. Our flashlights cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. That's when we started noticing the symbols, strange, arcane markings etched into the plaster and floorboards. They looked ancient, almost alive in the flickering light. "Guys, do you hear that?" April whispered, her voice trembling. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it too, faint, raspy whispers echoing through the halls. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a night that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As we delved deeper into the building, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be calling to us, though I couldn't make out any words. Mike suddenly stopped, his face pale in the dim light. "I don't feel so good," he mumbled, swaying slightly. Before we could react, his eyes rolled back and he collapsed to the floor. Jake and I rushed to help him while April hung back, her eyes wide with fear. When Mike came to, something was different. His eyes had a strange, glassy look, and when he spoke, his voice sounded oddly hollow. "We need to go deeper," he insisted, pushing past us and heading down a dark corridor. Jake and April exchanged worried glances, but followed. I trailed behind, a growing sense of dread gnawing at my stomach. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, they were motionless. We found ourselves in what must have been an old auditorium. Rows of rotting seats faced a stage draped in tattered curtains, and there, center stage, was a peculiar stone altar, covered in more of those bizarre symbols. Mike walked towards it, transfixed. "We need to complete the ritual," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. That's when April started screaming. She clutched her head, her eyes wild with panic. "Make it stop!" she shrieked. "The voices, they're in my head." I turned to Jake for help, but the look on his face made my blood run cold. His eyes had the same glassy sheen as Mike's, and a sinister smile played on his lips. "Don't fight it," he whispered. "Let them in." Panic seized me as I realized I was the only one left unaffected. Mike was at the altar, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. April had stopped screaming and now stood unnaturally still, her gaze fixed on some unseen point. Jake was slowly advancing towards me, that eerie smile still plastered on his face. I backed away, my mind racing. What was happening to my friends? What were these entities trying to possess us? I had to find a way out, to get help. But as I turned to run, I found my path blocked by April. Her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as she reached for me. "Join us," she hissed, her voice a disturbing mixture of her own and something other. "Become one with us." I ducked under her outstretched arms and bolted down the corridor. The whispers had become a deafening roar, and the symbols on the walls pulsed with an otherworldly light. I could hear my possessed friends in pursuit, their footsteps echoing behind me. Every turn led to another identical hallway. The building seemed to have transformed into an endless maze. My lungs burned as I ran, desperation driving me forward. I needed to find an exit, any exit. Suddenly, I spotted a window at the end of a corridor. Hope surged through me as I sprinted towards it. But just as I reached it, a hand grabbed my ankle, sending me crashing to the floor. I looked back to see Jake, his eyes now completely black, dragging me away from my only escape route. "You can't leave," he growled, his voice distorted and inhuman. "The ritual must be completed." I kicked frantically, my shoe connecting with Jake's face. He reeled back, momentarily stunned, giving me the chance to scramble to my feet. Without hesitation, I hurled myself at the window, feeling the glass shatter around me as I broke through. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline propelled me forward. I staggered to my feet, casting a terrified glance back at the building. My blood ran cold as I saw my three friends standing at the broken window, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, watching me with predatory intensity. I ran across the campus, my heart pounding in my ears. The few students I passed gave me strange looks, probably taking in my wild eyes and bloodied appearance. But I didn't stop to explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being pursued by something unseen. I burst into my dorm room, locking the door behind me. My roommate Chris jolted awake, startled by my sudden entrance. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. Between gasps, I tried to explain the night's horrifying events. Chris listened, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to fear. "We need to call the police," he said, reaching for his phone. But before he could dial, a sharp knock at the door made us both freeze. "Open up," came Jake's voice, but it was different, layered with other voices, as if multiple entities were speaking at once. "You can't escape us. The ritual must be completed." Chris looked at me, his face pale. "What do we do?" he whispered. I realized with growing horror that this nightmare was far from over. The knocking intensified, the door shuddering under the assault. Chris and I pushed against it, trying to hold it shut. "We need to get out of here," I panted. "Is there another way out?" Chris nodded towards the window. "Fire escape," he said. We rushed over, throwing it open. The cool night air hit my face as we clambered onto the metal structure. Just as we started descending, the dorm room door burst open. I caught a glimpse of my friends, or what used to be my friends. Their bodies contorted unnaturally as they crawled into the room. Their heads snapped towards us, eyes glowing in the darkness. We scrambled down the fire escape, the metal clanging beneath our feet. I could hear them following, moving with inhuman speed. As we reached the ground, a piercing shriek split the air, causing us to stumble. We ran across the campus, other students now awake and peering out of windows, drawn by the commotion. But no one came to help. Perhaps they couldn't see the horror pursuing us, or maybe they were too terrified to intervene. We finally reached the campus security office, bursting through the doors. The night guard jumped to his feet, alarmed by our panicked state. "Please," I gasped. "You have to help us. There's something in the old building. It's taken our friends." The guard looked skeptical but reached for his radio. That's when the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. In the silence that followed, we heard it, the whispers, growing louder, surrounding us. As the guard's flashlight flickered to life, illuminating the symbols now etched into the walls around us, I realized with dawning horror, the entity hadn't been confined to the old building, it had spread, and now, nowhere on campus was safe. Professor Trauscht was the kind of teacher every student admired. His lectures on ancient civilizations were captivating, and his knowledge seemed boundless. I was thrilled when he offered me a position as his research assistant. Little did I know, this opportunity would plunge me into a nightmare beyond imagination. It all began on a crisp autumn evening. I was organizing files in Trauscht's office when I accidentally knocked over a stack of books. As I scrambled to pick them up, I noticed a weathered leather journal that had fallen open. The yellowed pages were filled with bizarre symbols and disturbing sketches. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started reading. What I found chilled me to the bone. The journal detailed rituals of human sacrifice, dark incantations, and something called the convergence. At first, I thought it was research for a new course, but as I read on, I realized with growing horror that these weren't historical accounts. They were Trauscht's personal experiences. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly shoved the journal back into place. When Trauscht entered, I tried to act normal, but my racing heart threatened to betray me. As I left that night, my mind was reeling. Was my respected mentor really involved in such horrifying practices? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the images from the journal. I began to notice subtle changes in Trauscht's behavior. Hushed phone calls, frequent late-night meetings, and an unsettling gleam in his eyes. I knew I had to investigate further, but I had no idea of the terrors that awaited me. I decided to start my investigation by observing Trauscht more closely. I volunteered for extra work, hoping to gain more access to his office and personal effects. One evening, as I was helping him organize some ancient artifacts, I noticed a strange amulet around his neck. It matched a sketch from the journal. When Trauscht stepped out for a moment, I quickly snapped a photo of the amulet with my phone. That night, I scoured the internet for information about it. What I found left me sleepless. The amulet was linked to a long-forgotten cult that believed in opening gateways to other dimensions through human sacrifice. The next day, I overheard Trauscht talking on the phone about a gathering happening soon. My blood ran cold when I heard him mention needing volunteers. I knew I had to act fast, but I felt completely out of my depth. I confided in my roommate, Sarah, about what I'd discovered. She was skeptical at first, but the fear in my voice convinced her. Together, we decided to break into Trauscht's office that weekend to find more evidence. Saturday night came, and with trembling hands I picked the lock to Trauscht's office. Sarah kept watch outside. As soon as I entered, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, and there was a faint smell of incense. I quickly located the journal and started taking pictures of its pages with my phone. Suddenly, I heard voices approaching. I ducked behind a bookshelf just as Trauscht entered with two other professors. My heart nearly stopped when I heard them discussing the final preparations for the convergence. They mentioned a secret chamber beneath the university. As they left, I realized with horror that Sarah was no longer outside. Panic gripped me as I searched for Sarah. I tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Sarah's phone lay shattered on the ground, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in chalk. I knew I had to find her. but I couldn't do it alone. I considered going to the police, but who would believe such an outlandish story? Instead, I reached out to Professor Martinez, an anthropology teacher who had always seemed at odds with Trauscht. To my relief, Martinez believed me. He revealed that he had long suspected Trauscht of nefarious activities, but never had concrete evidence. Together, we formulated a plan to uncover the truth and rescue Sarah. The next day, we followed Trauscht discreetly. He led us to an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the campus. As night fell, we watched as robed figures began to arrive. Among them, I recognized several faculty members and even some students. Martinez and I snuck in through a back entrance. The building's interior was a maze of dark corridors, the walls covered in the same disturbing symbols I'd seen in the journal. As we descended deeper, we heard chanting echoing from below. We found a hidden staircase that led to a vast underground chamber. The sight that greeted us was straight out of a nightmare. Dozens of robed figures stood in a circle around an ancient stone altar. Sarah lay bound upon it, her eyes wide with terror. Trauscht stood at the head of the altar, the amulet glowing ominously around his neck. He raised a ceremonial dagger, his voice rising in a language I didn't recognize. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy. We had to act fast, or it would be too late. Martinez and I exchanged a desperate look. We had no weapons, no backup, and were vastly outnumbered, but we couldn't let them harm Sarah. In a split-second decision, I grabbed a heavy candlestick and hurled it at the main power switch. The chamber plunged into darkness, filled with confused shouts. In the chaos, Martinez and I rushed towards the altar. I managed to reach Sarah and started untying her bonds. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned to see Trauscht's face, contorted with rage. "You fool," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." His eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and I felt an unnatural force pushing me back. But Sarah, now partially free, kicked out, catching Trauscht off guard. In that moment of distraction, I noticed the amulet around his neck pulsing with an eerie light. Acting on instinct, I grabbed it and yanked hard. The chain broke, and a shockwave of energy knocked us all off our feet. The chamber erupted into pandemonium. Cultists ran in all directions, some attacking each other in the darkness. Strange, otherworldly screams filled the air, and I saw shadowy shapes moving at the edges of my vision. Martinez helped Sarah to her feet, and we ran for the exit. Behind us, I heard Trauscht's anguished cries. "The gateway! It's collapsing!" The ground began to shake violently, and chunks of ceiling started to fall. We barely made it out of the building before it imploded, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. As sirens wailed in the distance, we stood there, panting and shell-shocked, trying to process what had just happened. The aftermath of that night was a blur of police interviews and university investigations. Many of the cultists were arrested, but some, including Trauscht, were never found. The official story chalked it up to a dangerous archaeological experiment gone wrong, but we knew the truth. Sarah, Martinez, and I were hailed as heroes for exposing the cult, though we kept the supernatural details to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? The university underwent a major shakeup, with several staff members resigning or being fired. In the weeks that followed, I was plagued by nightmares. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something much larger and more sinister. The amulet I had torn from Trauscht's neck was never recovered from the rubble. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go through the photos I had taken of Trauscht's journal. As I zoomed in on one of the images, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the corner of a page, was a list of universities around the world. Our campus was crossed out, but dozens of others were circled. With trembling hands, I called Martinez and Sarah. We realized that what we had stopped might just be one small part of a global network. The convergence, whatever it was, might still be a threat. As I write this now, we're preparing to leave for another campus on that list. We don't know what we'll find, but we know we can't ignore it. The world may never know how close it came to an unspeakable horror, but we do. And we'll keep fighting, keep searching, to make sure it never comes to pass. If you're reading this and you notice anything strange on your campus, anything at all, don't ignore it. The truth is out there, and it's more terrifying than you can imagine.